great.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're ready now. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusive marketing today. We have a short time. It's a big topic. It's literally what I do for a career. We provide kind of like extensive training on multiple topics. So I'm trying to make this basically as short, but as impactful and valuable as possible for you all. First, just want to kind of introduce myself a little bit. Sorry if you're in the session I did this morning, because you'll have already kind of met me and heard this. But at AndHumanity, the company that I work at, which is an inclusive marketing agency, we share our lenses instead of like traditional bios. And the reason for this is because there really is no separating our lived experience from our work. And so just really owning, like who we show up as in the world, what that means, what we believe is important about ourselves. And that really personal acknowledgement that, we come with our biases, we come with our diversity, we come with our lived experiences. So I won't read this out loud to you, but I use they, them pronouns. I'm non-binary. My role is Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Brand Strategy, or JEDI. And I guess a couple of things I can share about myself that'll be relevant throughout the presentation are I'm queer, so both genderqueer and queer in sexuality, multiply neurodivergent, so I'm autistic and I have ADHD. And I'm currently super pregnant, so bear with me if I'm a little uncomfortable. I'm like 7 months into this journey. And I also really quickly want to acknowledge the land that I'm on today. I'm facilitating this session virtually from Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional land of many Indigenous people, including but not limited to the Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, and Métis peoples. And I just invite you to also take a moment to reflect on the land that you're on, its original peoples, and your personal role in and commitments to reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization. So as a settler myself, I have an accountability to reconciliation in my work, in my day-to-day life. So let's start with just like, this is a fact. It's undisputable that representation matters. And this is where I'm gonna share a little bit about myself with you. If you were in the intersectionality session this morning, you got like a little teaser of this already. But I am 30 years old and I have never, ever seen myself represented, not on television, not in marketing, not in media, not in communications. And as a, marketing and communications professional, this is a really interesting spot to be in. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. So basically ADHD and autism are really represented as these negative things. They're to be cured, which, surprise, they can't be neurodiversity. For like neurotypical consumption and sympathies. So there's never marketing or advertising or communication that's for me, it's about me. So you'll see this snapshot from an ad that got a ton of praise for being inclusive here. Take a minute and give an autistic person more time to process information. So that's about me, right? That's not for me. Only affecting children. So adults are pretty like absent from any representation of neurodivergence, and defined by really kind of like binary male stereotypes, which then gets into that other intersection of my identity, which is gender. And gender is represented through the binaries. So non-binary people don't exist. You go to most clothing websites, men, women. In advertising, look at the marketing and advertising. If you look at audience targeting, it's typically, we make these sweeping generalizations about male, female, and the binary kind of gender identity. And non-binary identities are also kind of constantly indirectly invalidated by like the language we use, the assumptions we make about what it means to be a person in our society, and that you kind of fit into male or female, and that comes with a bunch of different things. And this little like snapshot here kind of makes me laugh. Like, speaking characters, so 70% are male, 29% are female. This is an inclusive representation stat, and non-binary people don't exist. So also thinking about representation as like diversity as a checkbox. And so when I do see aspects of myself represented, it is in a very siloed way. So intersectionality, for example, my distinct experience as like a neurodivergent, non-binary parent with a career, getting my education, it just really doesn't exist anywhere. I see parts of myself maybe based on stereotypes or generalizations, but that whole human experience is really lacking a lot of the time. And really, I share this with you because this is really true for a large portion of the population. And a lot of you probably experience it to be true yourselves. This maybe isn't a surprise to you. So there are so many people that have never seen themselves authentically or positively represented. Which is strange because we're living in a really diverse world. So why are we kind of continuing to serve or to only show these really dominant lenses, often, like binary, male, white, abled, of a certain age, of a certain socioeconomic status, especially in our marketing. I won't read through all these stats, but I mean, really like some significant ones are, we're at minority majority status in terms of like race, ethnicity, culture, and Canada is going to be as a whole by 2036. Disabled people, huge percentage of the population, more or less invisible in terms of representation. The 2S LGBTQIA community, again, huge portion of the population, almost completely absent from depictions of, family in terms of marketing and communications. Age, we often see, middle-aged people, and two largest cohorts are seniors and youth. And then thinking about gender, women outnumber men, and gender diversity is just steadily increasing. And there's also so much power in authentic representation. Like media influences kind of how we see ourselves and how others see us. So for me, and for lots of people, this has been proven through like kind of multiple studies, marketing and representation can kind of show us what's possible. It can let us know we're not alone. It can shift how we actually see ourselves, positive or negative. It can shift our perceptions of those around us. It can shift, overarching social attitudes about a certain identity or group. And it can challenge biases and stereotypes. And so basically what you need to know about that is that marketing and society exist in a cycle. Marketing is impacted by societal biases. That is why we continue to see the dominant lens represented, despite the fact that our audiences are actually diverse. Marketing is impacted by these kind of old school beliefs about who we need to talk to, who has money, who's important, who has influence, and whose story is even, deserving of our time and attention. Also, though, marketing impacts social biases. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of actual progress in representation in marketing and communications. And similarly to, biases feeding into it, it also comes back around and has the opportunity to either kind of enforce or challenge our existing biases. So if we're intentional about kind of, what we're putting into our marketing and being inclusive in our marketing, we have the opportunity and the power to disrupt cycles of oppression. And so what is inclusive marketing? There are so many kind of disconnected, random sort of things floating around about inclusive marketing. But there has yet to be kind of a really holistic understanding of what it is. And so that's actually part of what we do at our agency is we're working on, defining it, bringing all these resources together, looking at all the different dimensions of diversity right now, figuring out how to measure inclusion in marketing in a way that's meaningful and inclusive, because that standardization just isn't there. And unfortunately, the result of that is that many people are claiming to be inclusive when they're not. They're doing the bare minimum. And so inclusive marketing, first and foremost, is not about including everyone. It's not about getting a bunch of diversity on a screen, visual diversity. It's about being really purposeful about who you're including and who you're excluding, and kind of going deeply into who you're including rather than tokenizing in terms of like a ton of diversity in an ad. And it's about intentionally not defaulting to the dominant lens. So taking the time to think, who am I representing? How am I representing them? Is this true? For who is this true? What stereotypes am I perpetuating? Our definition of inclusive marketing is elevating underrepresented voices and diverse role models through thoughtful and authentic marketing that deepens customer loyalty and influences positive change. And we also need to understand this kind of idea when I said, inclusive marketing isn't just having a bunch of people on a screen or on your social media or in an ad. This really distinguished nuance between diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So diversity is a fact. It's just existing and being present. When we do diverse marketing, we simply just put people who are different up, usually without thinking about the context, the social implications, the history, the nuances of being that actual person. Inclusion is a choice, and it's recognizing diversity, treating people equitably, and supporting people to thrive. So when we market inclusively, we're really thinking and being intentional about how people are being represented, and being, comfortable and having the lived experience lenses behind the scenes to be able to go into that actual lived experience rather than just tokenizing people based on what they look like. And belonging is a feeling. So it's the experience of being fully supported, engaged, and able to participate. And representation contributes to people's sense of belonging. And also belonging needs to happen kind of behind the scenes in inclusive marketing to actually have an inclusive output, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. So why are we so behind? I don't know. There's a resistance to change, I think, in inclusion overall. As an industry, I think marketing is kind of founded on some really problematic ideas, like we can categorize and generalize, but the data is like fully there. So I won't spend too much time on this section, but just wanted to bring it up because usually when I talk about inclusive marketing, there's some hesitation or there's some resistance to it. And so just really acknowledging that there's a misconception that in marketing, we have to choose between being inclusive or like performance and meeting KPIs. So like either I can have this inclusive ad or I can, reach the most people or resonate with the most people. It's just not true. So inclusive marketing does challenge those conventional marketing beliefs. I think that's why this comes up. It challenges that people can be categorized by a single dimension of their identity. It challenges that we can generalize people into these mass sweeping statements. It challenges that we can really understand people through a single facet of who they are because we're all complete human beings with intersectional identities. But there are new truths emerging in marketing as society moves to be more inclusive. And nearly every recent marketing report shows that inclusive marketing resonates. So inclusive marketing is just good marketing, full stop. I give it, like 5-10 years, it's just going to be marketing and it won't be seen as a niche anymore. There's also this misconception that inclusive marketing is niche and doesn't have mass appeal. So, if we're telling this really specific story or showing this really specific story in a nuanced way of this intersection, it's just not going to resonate more broadly with the population, or it's only for people who identify that way. But really, inclusive and intersectional advertising has mass appeal. Audience at large expect and reward it. Again, there's so many stats. I haven't included them in this presentation, but if you want any inclusive marketing stats, just send me an email. I've got a whole template I can share. And so let's talk a little bit about how to apply inclusive marketing in your work. And this is really going to be principles based. And that is because there is no, checkbox. There is no one thing that you can do in your marketing to make it inclusive. We have to start with principles. So bit of a recap from this morning if you were there when I was talking about intersectionality, but if you weren't, also didn't want to have you miss out. So in marketing, the way that intersectionality comes through is really that we are complete and complex human beings. We aren't this list of identities on the side. We are this kind of prism of complexity in this illustration here. And every color is overlapping with every other color and creating, unique shades and stuff like that. And so really recognizing that we experience, overlapping systems of oppression or privilege we might have, but we exist as like an entire human. You can't just put us into these tiny boxes of one aspect of ourselves. This means that there actually is no universal truth or experience. And telling a deep story with nuance is always more inclusive than leaning into a stereotype, a generalization, or taking a checkbox approach to diversity. So just, yep, that person's there in my marketing. There's also nothing about us without us. So by is best, with is good, and for is harmful. Those with lived experience need to be in leadership and decision-making roles. And that means in front of and behind the scenes. So how we represent equity deserving people, underrepresented people, is really important in front of the camera. But too many people think, okay, like, that's it, I'm done. Really, that only really happens authentically if those folks are also behind the scenes. There's not really any way to get around that. And so you don't have that inclusive product without that inclusive output, that inclusive process. And at minimum, this means consulting. Ideally, this would be, leadership from. But when we're consulting, it's really important to kind of avoid tokenization or relying on one person to speak on behalf of a dimension of identity. So, it's not consulting if you say like, okay, Sydney is the, one queer person on this project. Is this true? Or is this okay? Or is this all right for your community? Like that doesn't work. So consultation has to be meaningful and be informed by multiple lenses of lived experience. There's also inclusive spaces. So inclusive work only happens in inclusive environments. And so as an inclusive marketing agency, people are often surprised because we're not just like, okay, let's do the brief, let's do the creative, let's do the campaign, let's do the brand strategy. It goes back to like, what is actually happening and how inclusive are you overall? So power dynamics always exist. They need to be acknowledged and navigated before we can get anywhere and start being inclusive in our marketing. We need to prioritize learning and growth over perfectionism and defensiveness. So, being really open to like, how can I do better? Did I mess up? How can I improve? I need to grow. I am going to make a mistake. I might get called out in my marketing. What am I going to do if that happens? Diverse people really need to feel safe to share. So too often we have like a safe spaces statement or something like that. And we say, okay, you're invited to share your thoughts, but do people actually really feel safe being honest? And are they going to face repercussions for being critically honest? And then diverse opinions should actually be celebrated and acted on. So if you're having these conversations about your marketing, about your communications, you're inviting input, but you're not actually implementing that input, that's just performativity. Also, we need to challenge the dominant lens. So we often kind of unintentionally default to that dominant norm or assumption. For example, it's like, I'm going to do, an ad or something or a campaign about a family. And all of a sudden you have this picture of what a family looks like in your head, right? And they're of a certain age and they might have a certain skin tone and they might be, probably not visibly disabled. It's probably a heteronormative family. They might have children. And so we start making all these assumptions and these can seem really invisible too. So it's really important that we kind of surface this and ask ourselves, like, what am I seeing when I imagine this person or this group? We need to stop homogenizing equity deserving groups in our marketing and communications and acknowledge diversity within dimensions of identity. So one thing I like to do or ask people to do is kind of flip the statement to the dominant group and see if it sounds weird. So for example, like when we say often we'll say the queer community and inherently there's nothing wrong with that. There is queer community is beautiful, but then it's followed by this mass sweeping generalization. And so what if you flip that and you're like, well, the straight community, it's all like this. That sounds so strange. And we do the same, with race and ethnicity. We talk about maybe the Black community or the Indigenous community. But if you flip that and you try to make a mass sweeping generalization about the white community, that community is afforded a level of individuality in our representation that other groups may not be. So being really mindful of that. Forgetting norms and just not othering. So for every assumption, really asking, is that so? And explicitly kind of unpacking and challenging, every form of representation that you're moving forward with to really ensure that authenticity. And then seeking context and preference. So different dimensions of identity experience totally different stereotypes, have different histories, and have really nuanced needs around preferences and preferences around representation. So, We can't just talk about people of color in terms of accurate representations, stereotypes. People of different races, of different ethnicities have very different preferences and very different stereotypes and histories that we need to be aware of. And so really taking that time to kind of learn about the lens that you're representing. And that's necessary even if you identify with that lens personally, even if you have that lived experience. It's an essential kind of like critical perspective to take. There's also authenticity and reciprocity. So a lot of people, a lot of marketing can be transactional. We hire a model and the model is in the video. We pay an influencer and the influencer does something on social media for us. We hire a writer and that writer writes a script. But inclusive marketing is a lot about actually building genuine relationships. It's not transactional and it can't be extractive. So we need to put in the work to actually establish that trust. And brand marketing and communication need to align with how you're actually perceived and experienced. This is a huge one. Like some brands or some companies think like, oh, my marketing is my image and I can make it anything I want to. When it comes to inclusion, that's not the case at all. So what you're saying actually needs to align with what you're doing and your values and your impact. And performativity and callouts happen when they don't. So consumers are really smart and they don't want to see performativity in this space, and they're really good at finding it and drawing attention to it. And then be transparent and be clear about like mutual benefits. So what is the actual positive impact for those with lived experience? If I want to do an inclusive ad and I want to center a certain lens of identity, how is that actually positively impacting that person, and being really intentional about that? And what do they see as positive impact? Because it might not be what I see as positive impact. I might say paying someone, that's positive impact, but for them, that might not actually be aligned with what they expect. And then there's self-awareness. So this is really like challenging bias and challenging the shame around bias, which leads to biases persisting. So being really, mindful of, I'm having this thought. I know it's wrong. I know it's not okay. Don't push it down, surface it and ask yourself, why am I having that thought? Why am I having that assumption? Committing to a learning mindset. So, it's totally fine to ask respectful questions. Ignoring diversity just kind of continues this dominant lens approach and representation. And so it's totally fine to get curious and to ask respectful questions, and also to admit what you don't know. And you can frame constructive feedback as an opportunity for growth and a sign of trust. So, if someone does say, that question didn't feel respectful, even though you meant it as such, that means that person trusts you and they want you to grow. And resist the urge to explain yourself. And there's also getting comfortable with the idea that good inclusive marketers are actually just facilitators. You're not the expert. So sometimes people have to go from being, feeling like they're an expert brand strategist or social media manager or videographer, to being comfortable taking that step back and saying, I don't have the intercultural sensitivity or the lived experience or the right lens to actually tell this story authentically. And I'm not the expert here. And I just need to facilitate that story. And that's my role in this. And action is good, but checkboxes aren't. And so the most common thing in our work is when we work with brands, with clients, with other agencies, everyone wants to be like, okay, I'm making an action plan. Make me a checklist. I got to start doing. And this is great because like taking action is so necessary. But we really need to resist the urge to check off inclusion or create like a prescriptive how-to. Actual inclusive marketing is a principled and an ongoing approach. So for example, we've had people be like, okay, so we created our accessibility guidelines and that's it, we're inclusive now. And that's not really how it works. So understanding why we're doing this work and why it's important is what keeps us accountable to our impact through evolving action. And then we can continuously kind of update our plans for action. And process matters. So this needs to be infused into every single step of the process with intention and asking these really reflective questions of ourselves.
Sydney, we're at time and we need to
Yes.
give everybody a bio break. So I'll give you a few seconds just to wrap it up.
No worries. I'm right at the end anyway. So that's
Awesome.
actually really good timing. So a few things you can do, because this feels like a big topic. We can start with ourselves. We can engage our teams and have these discussions, and we can enjoy the journey and just get comfortable with the fact that this work doesn't end. It's not an expectation to be there anytime soon, but it is an expectation to start. And that's sort of the end of the session. So yeah, I'll